Hello, everyone, and welcome to another curatorial lecture in the Walters digital space. My name is Joy Davis, and I am the manager of adult and community programs here at the Walters Art Museum. And I have the pleasure of introducing one of our resident scholars, Jo Briggs. Jo Briggs is the Jennie Walters Delano Associate Curator of 18th and 19th Century Art, and she'll be covering the topic of food politics and grapes. Join me in welcoming Jo to the program. Good evening, Jo.
Hi, Joy. It's lovely to see you. So I'm going to get started on this very fall-tastic topic of this bunch of grapes. So this is a painting that appears very straightforward. It's a bunch of grapes of a single variety framed by vine leaves, and it's hanging by a blue ribbon. I hope you can make that out right at the top there. And if you could see this painting in person, what's most striking about it is actually its size. Framed, it's just over 1 meter high and a little under 1 meter wide. So that's about 3.5 feet by 3 feet. And I have to be honest, I've probably walked by this about 100 times in the galleries, and I haven't thought too much about it. But if someone spends the money and the time on a large oil painting like this, then they're certainly trying to make a point. So during lockdown, I've been reading about food culture in America, and specifically grapes. And it turns out there's a lot going on in this painting, and I think it's very interesting. Of course, what we eat and how we eat or where we buy our food is very much wrapped up in our identity. We might even say food is political. If I tell you that I'm vegan and I shop at Whole Foods, you're probably already building up a picture of who I am and what I believe in. Food was just as revealing in the 19th century. I'm from Britain, and I didn't realize that prior to the abolition of slavery in America, how you chose to sweeten your food was very significant. Sugar made from sugarcane was a product of slavery, and maple syrup was often used as an alternative, especially in the Northeast, as a way to distance food sweetenings from enslaved labor. So the idea was, like a boycott, this would hopefully have an economic impact on those who profited from sugar. I also realized as I was planning this talk that it's kind of telling that the word culture comes from the Latin word meaning to grow, which is obviously linked to food in the words horticulture, agriculture, or viticulture, which means grape growing. Okay, but first things first, who is this painting by? It's actually by an artist who spent his working life here in Baltimore, and who, unlikely as it might seem, made painting grapes his speciality. In fact, there's another of this artist's grape paintings at the museum, which I'm showing you here. The artist's name is Andrew John Henry Way, and he was born in Washington in 1826. He studied art in Cincinnati, but he left the United States in 1850 to finish his training in Europe, in Paris and Florence. After this, he moved to Baltimore, where he lived and worked until his death in 1888. Apparently, he'd planned to return to Europe, but was able to make such a good living from painting still lifes that he decided to stay here. And we actually know quite a lot about how Way worked, because shortly before his death, he wrote a series of articles for the magazine Art Amateur, and these were a sort of how-to about how to paint still lives of fruit. These articles were aimed at people who painted for a hobby or for recreation, so they gave quite specific instructions on the colors to use, technique, and composition. What is clear is that Way really liked grapes. He wrote that grapes are, quote, the most graceful and picturesque, and it seems to me altogether the most interesting of all fruits. No other fruit in Way's series got a whole article to itself. And the article on grapes gives some great insights, as although Way's paintings of grapes look so perfect they don't seem real, he writes that he always painted directly from bunches brought into his studio. He's very specific about how to select the best bunches to paint from. And the grape varieties that were, I guess the best models He especially mentions black Hamburgs, and I think this might be the variety in the painting to the right here. He also mentions Flamme de Tokay grapes, which I think are depicted in this painting. Of Tokay grapes, the artist wrote, and this is the quote on the screen here, "When they are half ripe, or midway in the change from green to red, they arrive at their most beautiful stage. At this period, all hues and tones of the spectrum may be detected in their rich but exquisitely delicate coloring." And I think the grapes here are maybe at that midway point. Right at the bottom and at the top of the bunch, they seem to be half green. While I don't know that you can find all the colors of the spectrum here, there is certainly a lot of variation and subtle coloring, especially in the shadows and the highlights. So all this obsession with grapes might seem eccentric on the part of the artist, but his focus on grapes reflects their importance in the culture around him at this time in the United States. Handbooks about gardens and farming also tended to devote more space to grapes than other fruit and vegetables. Elsewhere in American art, you can find grapes carved into a seat back. Here, in a chair made around 1855, made of rosewood that may have been imported from Honduras or Brazil. It was carved by a German-born furniture maker, John Henry Belter, at his workshop in New York. Grapes were embroidered on a purple or perhaps wine-colored velvet dress in 1890. And I hope you can make out the bunches of grapes in black beading that go around the large collar and down the front center of the skirt, around the bottom of the front, and around the bottom of the hem here. So both of these objects are in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And if you go to the Met's website and their Search the Collection page, and put in grapes and then limit the search by time frame to the 19th century, you'll see all kinds of objects decorated with grapes, like glass, silver, and ceramics. I think it's pretty hard to imagine turnips or potatoes getting the same treatment. So what was so special about grapes in 19th century America? I think one reason is that they seem to represent civilization, or rather civilization in some big quotation marks, because I'm really talking about upper class, waspish, very Eurocentric views of what that word civilization meant. The symbolism of grapes is certainly rich in European culture, and I'd like to point out here that my colleague Lisa Anderson-Zhu did a video on wine and the ancient Greeks and their drinking games. We could also think of Rome and the god Bacchus. He was the god of agriculture, wine, and fertility. And grapes are also prominent in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. There's also a sense of kind of old world refinement around vineyards, grapes, and wine. I think even today, vineyards seem somehow romantic or picturesque, unlike other types of agriculture. Touring vineyards is a leisure activity, and wine drinking is seen as somehow more special or classy than, say, beer. Because of these associations with the history of Europe, in the United States, once it gained independence from Britain at the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783, there was a sense that if grapes could be grown successfully in America and wine made from them, it would mean that the new country was on a level with European nations. In fact, Thomas Jefferson experimented, not successfully, particularly with growing grapes at Monticello. There was also an expansionist idea at work here that saw North America as empty. Of course, that wasn't true, but it meant that it was seen as ripe for agricultural cultivation, and that it would take the importation of European farming techniques to realize the full potential of land in the United States. In fact, by 1857, the Patent Office of the United States government had organized 2 grape expeditions, one to what is now Oklahoma, northern Texas, New Mexico, and the Rio Grande Valley, and a second that collected information on grape growing in New England and the Mid-Atlantic states. Between 1865 and 1866, so right after the Civil War, the Horticulturalist magazine ran a series of articles titled Grape Cuttings from History. and it surveyed the history of grape production in ancient empires. The magazine often encouraged westward expansion, pointing out how suitable some climates and terrain to the west were for particular crops, including grapes. Growing grapes was definitely seen as a genteel activity among white landowning elites. However, this view masked a lot of far less romantic realities. Before the abolition of slavery, work in vineyards would have been undertaken by enslaved laborers. In the area around Cincinnati, Ohio, an area known as America's Rhineland, work in vineyards was done by German immigrants. In fact, as the writer on grape history, Erica Hanikel, has uncovered, grape growing was part of land speculation in Cincinnati. Nicholas Longworth, who lived from 1782 to 1863, is often called the father of American wine, but he was just as much a real estate speculator. Longworth bought up land around Cincinnati, and while waiting for the city to expand and his land to become more valuable, he leased it to workers who had recently arrived from Germany to grow grapes. These grapes represented their rent, which Longworth could turn into wine and sell for profit. The vineyards also made the land more desirable for houses because of the positive associations with vineyards and their perceived attractiveness. Another slightly less romantic fact about grapes in the Northeast, where it's colder, is that the fruit relied on what were at the time new industrial technologies to flourish. Grapes typically had to be grown in greenhouses constructed from glass, sometimes in iron frames, and that if heated relied on coal and steam. I think it's likely that the grapes in this painting, which were grown on William Walter's country estate, St. Mary's, just outside Baltimore, which he purchased in 1866, were grown in a greenhouse of some kind. The painting was commissioned by Walters from Way in 1873 as a record of Walter's grape growing prowess. At this time, William Walters already had a large collection of paintings and Japanese and Chinese art. In fact, thinking back to the links I mentioned earlier between the words culture and horticulture, it might not come as too much of a surprise that the wealthiest section of society in America in the mid-19th century were often deeply interested in both fruit growing and art collecting. They kind of went together, as fostering both was seen as proof of America's strength as a nation. Nicholas Longworth in Cincinnati, as well as cultivating grapes, cultivated American artists like the sculptor Hiram Powers and the painter Robert Sheldon Duncanson. Duncanson's grandfather had been enslaved in Virginia, and after he gained his freedom, he moved to the north of New York State. At the age of 19, Duncanson moved to Cincinnati to begin his artistic career, and he later gained several commissions from Longworth. Here I'm showing a landscape by Duncanson from the Walters Art Museum, which we purchased in 2012, and it actually resembles the murals that Duncanson painted to decorate Longworth's mansion. The murals are still there, and the mansion is actually now the home of the Taft Museum of Art. So Longworth also supported the Cincinnati Academy of Fine Arts, just as William Walters supported MICA and the Peabody here in Baltimore. You might recall that I mentioned that Way went to Cincinnati to study before he went to Europe. I couldn't find any evidence that Way worked for Longworth, but he did study with an artist that Longworth knew by the name of John Frankenstein. But certainly in William Walters' commission from Way, artistic culture and grape culture intersected, resulting in this oil painting and others like it. So hopefully this chat's gone some way to explaining why we have a meter-tall oil painting of a bunch of grapes at the museum. I've only really scratched the surface of this topic. There's so much writing on food history. So I wanted to end with a few recommendations if you're interested in learning more about grapes or food generally in 19th century American culture. I really enjoyed a book called Empire of Vines, Wine Culture in America by Erica Hanikel. I used that book a lot when I was preparing this talk. And I really enjoyed the exhibition catalog Art and Appetite, American Painting, Culture and Cuisine, edited by Judith Barter, which accompanied an exhibition with the same title. The catalogue has really wonderful illustrations, and it reproduces 19th century recipes at the end of each chapter. And finally, I also want to recommend following the historian and historical costumer Jennie McKnight and looking at her YouTube channel, Not Your Mama's History. She has a lot of really great videos, and in one she interprets a slave cook from around 1850 and cooks in a 19th century kitchen, all while dressed in 19th century clothing, which is a little scary because she's wearing a long skirt and there's an open fire. I really enjoyed learning from her posts and videos since I've been spending time at home during lockdown, so if you haven't already, take a look at her work.
That's amazing. Who knew that one could be both obsessed with grapes, but also that there's so much to tell in the story of America about using grapes as kind of a vehicle?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a painting that doesn't really seem to be that complicated on the surface of things, but there's really a lot going on. And I think that's almost the case with still life generally in the history of art. You know, there's a lot of really interesting writing about Dutch still lifes and how they reflect sort of empire and expansion to the New World at that time. But we sort of don't think of still lives as very exciting, obviously very pretty to look at, but maybe not the most meaningful. So it was really fun to discover there's a lot going on with this painting that seems so straightforward.
Absolutely. And just his general obsession with grapes, right? It's very interesting in his and how he really thought about it. It wasn't just he liked the fruit, right? Like he enjoyed eating the fruit. We have a question, and then hopefully more people will include their questions in our comment section. We really encourage that. From Julia Keller: were grapes hard to come by? And I think this is framed in the time frame of the painting being created.
Yeah. Hi, Julia. Thanks for the question. So this is a really interesting facet of the story, which I didn't really have time to get into for this talk, but there are wild grapes that are native to America. But the Europeans that moved here really felt that they weren't really up to much. And they brought European grapes here, which are obviously harder to grow because they're not native. So often they would need a greenhouse or, you know, special treatment. However, the vine that was actually most successful was a crossbreed between native species and European imports. So in that sense, grapes weren't hard to come by, but maybe the particular grape that you wanted was hard to come by.
And that tells me that there's some politics happening there, of course, about what grapes are superior.
Yes.
So that brings that to mind. I actually have it's a little open-ended, so if you would indulge, but you brought up a few, I don't know if you can expand on horticulture research and Western expansion, or just colonialism, expansion in general, and how horticulture research really is in tandem, or research of any kind of the botany or flora and fauna in an area is really works in tandem with that. It doesn't, it's not separate.
No, it's definitely not separate. They're very intertwined. And, you know, obviously what I know best about now is grapes, so I can talk to that a little bit better. But yeah, there was definitely a sense that America was somehow this blank canvas that was there to be made lush and profitable by settling, and going out and finding out, you know, where the best soils were and where different things grew was definitely kind of an incentive for people to move to those areas and turn them into farming. And, you know, the Horticulturalist was definitely part of that. The magazine that I mentioned, that was really read by, you know, kind of landowning elites all the way down the East Coast, but also had a much larger circulation. So yeah, I mean, they're completely inseparable, and I guess, you know, it's that knowledge is power thing, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think we've learned so much in this lecture. So for those that might have joined us late, there's a lot embedded in your lecture about that, and kind of new ways we can think about just grapes alone, but just the horticulture in our country. very interesting. There's a question from Ariel O'Connor. Hi, Joe. In your quarantine fruit research, did any other fruit surprise you as well? Something you weren't expecting to learn?
Oh, wow. Yeah, Ariel, that's a great question. One of the things that sticks with me is that Wei was very disparaging about bananas and how there was no artistic way to treat bananas. I don't really know what he meant by that. He was quite old when he wrote these articles. The other thing that was surprising is that he's very down on Impressionism. Does not like Impressionism, says it's no good for still life painting. You need to be nice and detailed, but not too detailed. So I feel like I've learned a lot about Wei and his fruit, his kind of fruit particularities, which is a little bit surprising that someone can have such strong opinions about both art and fruit, I suppose.
And just the juxtaposition between something that is triggering about bananas.
Yeah.
And they're
I don't even want to
finite form.
like what
There's just a comment here, but I think it's worth sharing. Kathleen says, my grandparents brought their grapevines from Italy in 1928. And I think that just speaks again to how grapes work in their environment. And maybe, I mean, of course, neither of us are grape experts. You certainly are more than I am. But that, you know, it's really interesting how those get integrated into American horticulture and farming.
Yeah, I love the idea that, you know, it was so important to have this grapevine that you would like carefully pack it up and bring it all the way from Italy. I'm guessing that was on a boat, probably not on a plane. So I think that just really speaks to how important and how meaningful that plant would have been. And I guess like even economically so, that if you have a vine, you kind of can begin to make your own way in the world.
That's a very good point, just from a financial standpoint, but also from a familial cultural standpoint of how important that would be.
For sure.
Susan Fingerman asked, did the Walters family, I'll just put in parentheses, did the Walters family make wine?
That is such a great question. Did the Walters make wine? What I can definitely say is that they really liked wine. So Henry Walters had an amazing wine cellar, and that's a whole other talk, but he collected very rare wines and was gifted wines by JP Morgan. I don't know if they made wine. Of course, they're most associated with rye whiskey, which is how William got his start. His fortune began with liquor trade, specifically rye whiskey. I will have to do some more research on whether William used his grapes to make wine or not.
Interesting. I'm going to take this question from Winona Caesar. They asked, did anyone stain canvases with wine, kind of like how people stain paper with tea, coffee for added artistic, I'm guessing, expression?
Greg, we have a conservation question, I think. So I happily have a conservator on hand here. The question is whether you could stain your canvas with wine to create a kind of, you know, non-white surface to paint on. Greg's thinking about it. He says it's
Greg Bailey or
wine stains.
He can totally come and join us for sure.
Come join us. He's feeling shy. It's not going.
Okay.
He says that it would be unorthodox but possible. We can experiment. Let's experiment. I'm up for it.
I think we still have a little bit of quarantine left, and so I think we have some projects we can do.
I would say so. Yeah.
And a last question from Ariel: where did the painting originally hang after it was commissioned? I don't know if you know this, but maybe you could pontificate.
That is a really great question. I am now trying to remember if it hung early in the museum or not. It may have been in their private rooms and not the museum for a certain amount of time. I've always liked to imagine that it hung in the country house where he was growing the grapes as a kind of show-off thing when people came around and be like, look what I grew, kind of thing. But I'm not sure. We could definitely find out. We have really good records of where all the paintings in the museum were hanging, basically from 1880 onwards. So I could certainly figure that out.
That's wonderful. I think we have okay, Banana says thank you. I want to thank you, though, for sharing this kind of remarkable take on grapes, and its connection to our history, and what a remarkable man this Mr. Way was in his approach.
He was.
I want to thank our digital team for without this wouldn't happen. And I want to thank that. I want to give a shout out to Greg, who's off camera, but was helped us with some work earlier and gave his insights. I also want to thank you, the audience, for giving your questions and giving your time and joining us on these programs. It is very important. You see at the bottom of your screen here that we have the walters.org/events. We would love for you to go there, see what is available in our programs, and join us for more. We have a program this Thursday at 5:30 featuring Jay Gould, moderated by Allison Gulick. So we are really excited to continue our digital program into the fall, and we will see you in the next program. Bye for now.